So it's been a month since the U.S. and Israel launched strikes on Iran, and there's still no end to the conflict in sight. For more on this, we're joined today by Professor Robert Lawrence, Professor of English and Turkic Studies at Dongduk Women's University. Professor Lawrence, thanks for coming on today.
Good morning. Thank you for having me.
So the Pentagon is reportedly preparing for weeks of ground operations in Iran. Is the Trump administration choosing to escalate this war? What do you make of the latest developments?
Right, where there's one Marine Expeditionary Unit on the way, and there's one that's already in the region, apparently. That's about 5,000 Marines. There's also the 1st Brigade Combat Team, which is a rapid deployment force from the 82nd Airborne that's either in the region or on its way right now. In addition, there's the George H.W. Bush Carrier Strike Group is underway on the way to the region. That's going a little underreported, but that should replace ostensibly the Gerald Ford, which is in Crete right now. When we hear things about the Pentagon preparing for weeks, those types of contingency plans don't necessarily mean that that's what's going to happen. They plan for all types of contingency plans, and then they give those to the president, and the president eventually makes a decision. So nothing's inevitable with all of that. If we look historically speaking, under this administration, when they've put assets into a theater, they have used those assets. But this could very well just be posturing for negotiations, right? Kind of maximizing, your threat escalation maybe for negotiations. As far as actually doing this, putting boots on the ground in one of the islands or some of the coastal areas along the Strait of Hormuz, this is extremely risky. Troops will be pretty vulnerable, I think, to drones and possibly missile attacks while they're there. And this may not sit very well back in the U.S. There's some polling data that's come out recently that would probably encourage the president to be cautious about some of this, but we really don't know. The final decision lies with Donald Trump. So, he may be trying to posture himself for negotiations, but certainly, as we've seen before, if he's pushed, then he hasn't really shied away from using whatever he thinks he needs to use. So time will tell, I guess.
Right. We'll have to wait and see. And President Trump has again extended his self-imposed deadline for Iran to reopen the Strait of Hormuz until next month, that's April 6th. But Iran continues to say it's not negotiating with the White House. Are the two sides far from reaching a deal?
Well, Iran keeps saying that, but we know that there are third-party interlocutors that are kind of passing messages back and forth. So, it's one thing I would say is that it's difficult to underestimate the level of distrust between these two sides. From the Iranian perspective, twice in 8 months, they've been in negotiations, and the U.S. has ended up attacking them. And from the U.S. perspective, basically, there's been decades of dishonesty and deceit. So, it's tough to say how big of a problem this is in any negotiation. Both sides are claiming that they're winning right now, and they're sticking to this maximalist rhetoric. Iran wants recognition of its sovereignty over the strait, and the U.S. basically wants capitulation. So, I don't really see how either side finds the other's demands to be acceptable. With the attacks on Iran increasing over the weekend, U.S. personnel and material increasing in the region, and the Houthis entering the conflict now. And just about 2 hours ago, it was reported that Iran hit a desalination plant in Kuwait. So, when we see all of this combining, there's nothing that really indicates that there's an off-ramp, which would indicate that both sides are trying to actually end this. However, this could very well be a negotiating tactic, and it's nothing new about that. Showing force while heading into negotiations is just trying to give yourself a better position at the table. So that might be what it is as well. Eventually, I guess we're going to have to see if either side really wants to end the conflict, or if they're so determined to make the other bend to the other's will that they're just not going to stop.
Right, and Pakistan said it's ready to host the talks between the United States and Iran after diplomats from Saudi Arabia, Egypt, and Turkey met in Islamabad. How might that help bring an end to this conflict?
Regional foreign ministers have been busy. They had this meeting yesterday in Islamabad, and they say it was very productive. Pakistan is saying that both the U.S. and Iran have shown confidence in them as a mediator, and they're passing messages through Pakistan to each other. And they said they're also prepared to host bilateral talks in the coming days. If these diplomats can come up with a creative off-ramp that's somehow suitable for both sides, then there's a possibility. But right now, it just seems like they're trying to lay the groundwork for talks to actually happen, a step-by-step process. And I think that that's probably as ambitious as they need to get right now. Just getting the two to talk will be a bit of a victory, and we can move forward from there. Eventually, it's going to take those two sides to show the will to negotiate. But like I said before, right now it really seems like each of them are bent on making the other capitulate. So we'll see how effective these foreign ministers can be on getting the two sides to the table. But there may take more external pressure, and in the U.S. case, it may take domestic pressure for something like that to happen.
Right, right. And you mentioned Houthis joining the war. And they've actually claimed responsibility for missile attacks on Israel for the first time since this war began last month. How far is the war expanding?
Right. Well, the Houthis' entrance into the war is not unexpected. Everybody's been waiting to see when they're going to do what, basically. Now, it is extremely dangerous, though, because of the flow of oil more than anything. So the Houthis are on one side of the Bab al-Mandab, which is a strait between Yemen and Djibouti, which is the entrance into the Red Sea. Now, the reason this is important is because in order to bypass the problem with the Strait of Hormuz, the Saudis have enacted the East-West pipeline. They've increased their output going through the East-West pipeline, which goes from the Persian Gulf and Abqaiq over to Yanbu, the port of Yanbu on the Red Sea. Now, as of yesterday, they've brought this to full capacity. They're putting 7 million barrels per day through the pipeline, 2 million for domestic purposes and 5 for the global energy markets. Now, from Yanbu, it can go a couple of different directions. It can get on tankers to go to Egypt and then out through the Sumed, which puts oil into the Mediterranean and onward to Europe. But a lot of it right now is going out the southern route through the Bab al-Mandab. And this is going to Asian markets. Now, the Houthis, because this strait is only about 29 kilometers across, this is a very narrow strait that can be shut down fairly easily. And the Houthis have a number of options they can use to make this situation much worse. For example, they could fire on the Yanbu port, or they could hit ships in the Red Sea. They could close down the strait, the actual Bab al-Mandab, or they could hit the East-West pipeline like they did in 2019. They hit Afif in Saudi Arabia. So any of these options would really make a massive problem. You would disrupt supply security in global energy markets. And as of right now, I think 10 minutes ago, Brent crude was selling at 115 a barrel. About 2 months ago, it was selling at 60. So it's almost already at double. If you knock out 5 million barrels per day off the market, then that could be a real significant blow to global energy markets and the global economy at large. So I think that's the biggest threat coming out from the Houthis. So we'll see how they want to engage in this war.
Right, we'll have to see how that goes. All right, Professor Lawrence, thanks so much for taking the time today. We appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.